Well, there we are. Now, what did I write? I wrote this the other day, you know. Memories of a lad from Lower King Street in the 40s. Okay, now, this may not be a matter of passionate interest to those who are alive at the moment. But I'm assuming that maybe in 100 years' time people may well be interested in these things, and so that's why I do it. And I'll be around, I'm sure. I'll be keeping an eye on things. I like to watch things, of course. And I might sort of flutter by as a moth or a butterfly or something like that in 2122. And, well, if all is well, I will be a very kindly sort of ghost. But if not, I'll do the old Chinese trick and I'll be the hungry ghost, and there may be trouble. So let's hope that posterity deals with this kindly. Okay. Now, I'm going to describe a very specific life. Whether it was typical of the town or the times, I really cannot say. I can only tell you of life as it was for us. And if I think it was grossly untypical, then I will certainly say so. Well, I'll try to say so, if I remember to say so. Now, when I say the life may not be typical, your life is not at that age one that is freely determined by you. And so whether our life was the one that we would have chosen had we been free to do so, I doubt very much, of course. But I suppose I need to add these caveats. Our household, I think, was a little unusual in that my father was born in 1915 into a very poor family. Many kids. Grandfather, as far as I can tell, was very frequently on unremunerative work or maybe even unemployed. I'm not quite sure. I know at one stage he was sick with typhoid or something like that. My grandmother had to bring some money in by going out and cleaning out board drains. I don't know whether people still do that or not, but I think I can remember, even when I was young, people talking about board drain cleaning. Apparently the water will flow if it's not impeded, and I think the board drain cleaner's job is to prevent or clear impediment. Not a pleasant job at all, and would have been out in the sticks, and I know my grandmother did that at one stage, but it was a home that really had nothing in it. Tiny little house, lots of kids, I know, 2 bedrooms, 2 verandas, and that was about it. And so my father was brought up, you know, with nothing, and he claimed that they were brought up on bread and dripping. Now, I think that was a bit of an exaggeration, but not a big exaggeration. It was probably not the big exaggeration that he claimed. Maybe it was not as bad as all of that. I don't really know. But I do know that one of the things he valued throughout his life was getting a good feed. And if there was one thing that impressed him more than anything else, and that impelled him more than anything else, was the notion of getting a feed, which caused me to think that maybe in his youth a good feed was not something that was easily come by. My mother, she was fostered for many years by a very genteel family in Melbourne, and so much, and insofar as she knew her P's and Q's, which I might add she did know, and which she certainly was at some pains to pass on to us, she did know those things, but she made a fatal mistake at one stage. She was only about 13 or 14 or something like that, and she discovered where her birth mother was, and she was out in Charleville, and so for some reason or other she felt impelled to leave the home of the foster family that she'd been with since she was a little girl, and headed out to Charleville to join her mother, who didn't exactly welcome her. But so she arrived in Charleville, and the genteel family in Melbourne had not really well equipped her for, you know, ordinary mundane housewifely duties, in that she knew very little about, say, cooking and sewing and things like that. And so while she didn't come from a background of utter deprivation, She was not entirely with the skills that, made for a simple and not very affluent house in Charleville. And so put the two together, and so it may well be that their view of the world and their view of things and their experience with things was such that it reflected in our lives in the 1940s. And so it may well be that what I tell you about our life in the 1940s may in fact not really be typical of the 1940s. It may have been typical of the 1920s or early 30s or something like that. But, historians will judge that and determine in time whether our life there was typical or not. Anyway, what I'm going to do is to divide my life as I experienced it and the life of my brothers and sisters, and of course I would also include my cousin who lived just down the road, and into its various compartments that were very obvious to me. I'm going to deal with it in terms of weekdays, and then I'm going to divide those weekdays of the year into two divisions. One, half the year, I suppose, when the cow wasn't milking, and weekdays for the other half of the year, well, if it was a half year, when the cow was milking. Then I'll move on to the weekend, Saturday, Sunday. I'll then move on to diversions and things like that, so that I would hope somehow or another, even if it's ultimately by accident, to give a picture of the time. Okay, well, I'm going to begin with the school days in that half of the year, if, as I say, it was half of the year, when the cow was milking. Oh dear. Okay, now, in this household there were two senior children, me and my younger brother. And in that half of the year when the cow was milking, one of us in 1 week milked the cow, which also meant getting the cow, finding the cow, while the other one's job was to take responsibility for cutting the chips, gathering the chips on the night before, and then getting up early in the morning and starting the fire so that breakfast, such as it was, would be cooked. Okay. Well, let's deal with the thing that I hated most. The thing I hated most, and that we had to do, and I'm sure that I was alone of everyone in our class who had a family that had a cow. Well, in our family and at our end of town, we didn't think that was particularly unusual, but I can't remember any of my classmates talking about coming to school after finding the cow and milking the cow, but maybe they kept quiet about it, I do not know. But anyway, it went a bit like this. Now, I can't remember the routine exactly, but I'm assuming that after the cow was milked, she was turned loose for the day with her calf. And then maybe later in the day, in the afternoon, she was brought back in, the calf was impounded for the night, the cow was set free once again to graze during the night, and in the morning you had to get up, and I think she may have been milking often during winter, since I can well remember those cold mornings of getting up and finding the cow. Now, my father was not one for buying expensive cars, nor was he one for buying expensive cows. And just as the cars usually didn't work and were bought for a song, and on one occasion the remuneration he got when he actually sold one of these dreadful cars was a clucky chook. Well, I don't know how much a clucky chook is worth, but that's all he got for the car, and it probably wasn't worth much more anyway. Excuse me, but you'd have to get up and find your cow. Now, this cow, Ruby, she was a red cow of no great worth, not a good milker, a willful creature, that my father took great pride in because he said she was a battler. Well, of course, my father saw himself as a little Aussie battler, and so there was a certain affinity, therefore, between him and the cow. But she was a bloody awful cow, I can tell you. But nevertheless, on most occasions, when you'd get up to find her in the morning, you'd think, well, where will she be? So you think, well, I'll go to where she was yesterday. And she used to like grazing on whatever grass could be found growing in the drain that flowed out of the sewage treatment works down towards the 4 Mile, I suppose. I don't know how. Yes, I think it ended up down near the 4 Mile, and it was a bit of a swamp down near Joe Barion's place, I think, when Joe was alive. And she would graze there, and if you were very lucky, on the second morning, the subsequent morning, she'd probably be a little bit further down the moor drain. But there was always that terrible time when you went down there. You knew she wouldn't be on the sandhill, and she certainly wasn't going to be in the cemetery. She had to be somewhere along that moor drain, but you would go, and there was no sign of Ruby. Ruby, that I don't know whether I said Ruby. Oh, a red cow, bony hips. She would trot along in a huff, if impelled. And she had 2 horns, one of them broken. But she was not a sweet-natured thing. She was a cow hard to love, I can tell you. Anyway, sometimes, of course, you couldn't damn well find her. Well, that was no damn good. You had to find her. And so you'd then use your wit, because we learned over time that sometimes she would migrate. What she must have done is she must have gone along the drain from the sewage treatment works, cut down behind the golf links, and then gone up to somewhere near what is now the School of the Air. Now, there's a house just near there, and there used to be attached to that house sort of cow yards. Fairly sturdy cow yards, I can tell you. In those days, that house, and I think all of that land beyond there, belonged to the Dens. The Dens are always a family of some mystery to us, since we never met them socially, and we never actually saw them very much. And if you'd passed them in the street, you wouldn't have known them. Apart from the fact that if Ruby took the migration from the sewage treatment works over on that side of the gully to the far side, you could be sure that when you found her there, and you found her there as a last resort, bearing in mind that she still had to be milked and you still had to get to school on time, she was very often impounded by the Dens, because the Battler Ruby had broken through the fence and Mr. Den had imprisoned her. And, oh dear, well, what were we to do? But anyway, you had to swallow your pride and go upstairs, knock on the door and say, Mr. Den, would you let our cow out of your yard so that we can take her home? Well, we weren't greeted with any great affability, I can tell you, and with some huffing and puffing and general expressions of displeasure and so on. He would indeed go down and let the cow out, and we would drive home, and then you would milk her. Well, you'd bring her home and you'd put her in the bales and you'd tie a leg up with one rope and so on, and you'd begin milking, and you began milking a bit. Then after you'd milked a bit, you'd let the calf out of the pen. The calf would have a good old suck. You'd pull the calf back into the pen, and by that time Ruby would have, as my father put it, let down her milk, such as it was. And such as it was, if you were lucky, was that it was untainted. But there's a certain time of the year when Ruby would eat a tainted weed or tainting weed. Oh, the milk was absolutely terrible. Well, we had to use it because beggars can't be choosers, you see. And I do recall one stage there was a butter factory in Roma called Artesian Butter, and they made wonderful butter, but they made the mistake at one stage of using tainted milk. The butter was tainted, and that was the end of the Artesian Butter Factory. Very foolish. They'd have done better to do nothing for 6 months or whatever it may have been than it was to ruin their business totally by using tainted milk. It was foul, but of course the butter was bad enough. But having to use the tainted milk on your breakfast of rolled oats, Uncle Toby's rolled oats, that was torture, I can tell you. But nevertheless, so that Ruby would let down her milk, and you'd milk the cow and away you'd go. That had its dangers, because you'd sit on a box or a stool or something like that, and in the middle of all of this, Ruby would decide she was going to relieve herself. Well, she'd hump her back. Well, when she humped her back, you knew to move, because, look, it was like the original flood. Oh, it was terrible. There'd be splash, 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 and if you didn't get out of the road in time, you had splashy legs, and there's a certain amount of poop around about too, I might add. And you had to protect the milk, and oh dear, it was a terrible business. But when you couldn't find the cow, you were panic-stricken, because A, you knew that she was probably impounded by the Dens. You knew that you were going to have to suffer the indignity of pleading for the release of your cow. But you also knew that you had to get the cow milk and get to school on time, because the shame of getting to school late and asking if you could come into the room with 50 kids in the class peering at you, why is he late? And you have to say to Bill Adams or whoever it may have been, well, I'm late because I couldn't find the cow. Well, I think I was the only person probably, or me and my brother were the only people in the school who had to find our cow before school. So that may have been typical of an earlier time, but there it was. Anyway, that was the week. In the mornings, we then had breakfast of that bloody awful Uncle Toby's oats. But we could have the breakfast of the Uncle Toby's oats because the fire had been lit by my sort of coadjutor, if you like. And so you'd go over in the afternoon, if you're on Chips Week and so on, lighting the fire week, you'd go over to the wood heap, because remember, we didn't have an electric stove. I don't know that anyone did. Even our very rich aunt and uncle down the road, they didn't have an electric stove, and so I think that must have been as it was. But you go and you get the chips, and if you could find, if there was an old apple case occasionally turning up, getting a bit of pine was very good because the fire lit very easily with, the split pine that you could chop up with a tomahawk. And you would hope that our father had got in a goodly supply of boxwood, because boxwood is very easily cut, splits very well, burns quite well, and burns reasonably easily. But occasionally, of course, the supply of boxwood ran out, and we were left. I don't think it would have been mulga. It may have been mulga, I'm not sure. Or it may have been gidgee, but if you had gidgee, well, of course, you were really in trouble, because my father was famous, within our family anyway, for having, I don't know where he got the tools from. Usually he must have found them at the dump, I think, because he loved dumps in case things came in handy. It might come in handy one day. And if he went to the dump, he never left the dump empty-handed. He had saws, sometimes with handles, sometimes without handles, but always blunt. He had various other implements of no great quality. Axes were never sharpened, and you may as well have used an Aboriginal stone axe to cut gidgee as use the axes that we had, because they were never sharpened. Okay for splitting things, splitting box, that was okay, but it was a terrible business. And so you'd have to get the chips in the evening, and then you'd have to get enough wood in, probably at the same time, so that the fire could be lit subsequently, and that bloody awful Uncle Toby's rolled oats could be made. Occasionally, though, we did have, breakfast delight. I don't know whether they still make it, but breakfast delight wasn't too bad. But that rolled oats, and particularly if you had the tainted milk, it was not good. So, but of course, you think, well, this is a pretty primitive life. And indeed, in the early years, it had to be a primitive life, because remember, the first few years, up until 1945, it was wartime. There were no toys, and the country's industry was not geared to the fripperies of, indulging youth. Although I think that maybe at Christmas time, when Santa Claus came, I think they've continued throughout the war years to produce those little, we call them lucky stockings. The shops would sell them, and they had a cardboard backing and a red sort of gauze in front, and inside a number of absolutely worthless items. There was a little packet of tiny little lollies, the size of ball bearings. Well, you could at least eat them or suck them or something like that. There was always a whistle with a feather on the end of it, that very frequently, it always stopped working after a few blows on it. And other than that, I don't know, there might have been a so-called comic that, would certainly never sell in the shops. Not wonderful things, but that was about all there was. I can't remember having any toys, and I don't think that most people didn't have very much until, a few years after the war. I know that, I suppose you could buy toys. You could buy snakes and ladders, boards like that. But I don't even know whether during the war you could get snakes and ladders, but certainly after the war I know we used to get snakes and ladders, Ludo and things like that, I think. Not that we got them, but our cousin down the road usually had them, and that did have an advantage to us, because he was the only child in the family, and the family was, fairly careful. And they had a nice house down the road, just opposite my grandmother and grandfather's place. Ours was a little, shall we say, Spartan. Spartan in all ways. So there we are. But anyway, you have breakfast, and well, of course, while we were having breakfast, my mother was cutting the lunches. Now, these were times when there was no sliced bread. And my mother was not particularly gifted, with the fine motor skills, and so when she would cut the sandwiches, there were slabs of bread, and in winter, the butter was always frozen, so you had blobs of, slabs of butter, I think in the hope that maybe it would melt a bit during the day before lunch. And not much to put on them. I think Mum probably from time to time put on another slab of stolen leg of lamb indeed, get out, mutton leg, aged mutton leg probably, just depending upon what my father in haste selected to steal. Not that he always stole, but he fairly frequently did, And so, my robust old age is one to which I give the credit to the stolen mutton. Well, well, there's nothing wrong with that. You see, I told you I spent a lot of time in China, many, many years in China. And the Chinese have a very sensible approach to theft. Some theft is quite justifiable and forgivable, and some theft is absolutely beyond the pale. Theft from a rich person, who wouldn't do it? Who wouldn't do it? And there was no shame in stealing from a rich person. He probably deserved to be stolen, and in any case, what would be the actual damage to the person? Not much. But anyone who stole from a poor man deserved almost social banishment. To steal from a poor man occasioned to the poor man terrible inconvenience, great pain probably, and anyone who stole from a poor man, no, that was absolutely unconscionable. And so there we are. So I don't know. I think we took the Chinese view in that if my father stole a sheep, well, it was from a rich man, and in any case, as he said, the bastards all steal from one another. And so this lot is stealing from this lot. It was like a sort of a circle, and my father just intruded himself into it as an uninvited guest, but nevertheless, he got in when he could, and he'd go off into the bush, and he'd return now or so later with a hogget over his shoulder. Because he was not the only one in his family, there was uncle, I won't say which one, who was found, out. He was at the imbibing, having a beer, an ale, as they say, at the cattle camp, I think, and the police found a dead sheep and a rifle in the back of his car. Well, when it was pointed out to him that there was a dead sheep and a rifle in the back of his car, he exclaimed, in the best biblical sense, stentoriously, "Who, an enemy, hath done this?" And so he was very surprised, all taken aback. I don't know what happened. He wouldn't have been found guilty, of course, if he went. I don't know whether he went to court. Maybe he did. But anyway, an enemy hath done this, I'm sure he claimed. And that was the end of that. So anyway, that was the morning of Chips Week or Cow Week, whatever it may have been. Off we'd go to school, the routine of the school I've told you. And we'd finish school at 3:30, and then we'd make our way home idly, usually down along the gully, or if that girl was fighting people over there on Anson's Corner, very prudently, either on the other side of the footpath near the school fence over there opposite Tat's Hotel, or if you felt you might have been in personal danger because you could have been the randomly chosen person even from afar, a prudent person in that case would go out the Watson Street gate of the school and go home down that way. Or, if you're really cowardly and danger was really afoot, you'd go out the Paris Street gate, and then you'd go up to the Will Street, then go along Will Street to the Railway Hotel, and then you'd go down King Street. But that was a very dull way, and so you'd only do that in extremis, I would have thought. But otherwise, you'd make your way home by the gully, and, well, in spring, the parrots were nesting up in those gum trees along there. I don't know what the street is, the one that the one that we used to go past the block that, the east-west road that used to go past the site of the old hospital, not the new one, the old one. And so all the down there, the parrots would be nesting because you could never reach them because they were very high up. And so you'd get home and I would chat with such people as I could on the way home. You never know who you would meet along the way home. Some people you never saw. If you went up Paris Street, going south, the first house you came to was the house of Mr. Blair, the Irish tenor. He was a tallish man. I don't know whether he had red hair or what, but all concerts featured Mr. Blair, the Irish tenor. I didn't like it very much because it was a horrible sort of falsetto to me, and the Irish eyes are smiling was not something that really excited me, but nevertheless. And then, of course, who else would you meet? There were two lovely ladies down there in King Street, down towards West Street. I think they were called Perkins, mother and daughter. Had a little cottage, and I used to love it very much because it struck me as being a very English sort of cottage. The only thing was missing was hollyhocks. But they had a nice little lawn of couch grass in front. And then there was sort of greenery on the veranda, and they had oleanders near the gate. But they were always very polite, and I made sure that I always raised my hat to them, as my mother insisted that we should. And then I would get home. If I went down Paris Street, of course, I'd come past Moore's shop. And, well, of course, if you walk past the football grounds, they used to have that saltbush hedging along Paris Street there, that Paris Street side. And if you looked there at certain times, you could find caterpillars. And if you got the caterpillar, a green thing with a bit of white on it and a sort of a spike on its bum. And I think that, was it that? No, they were just of interest. No, it was on the oleanders that every now and then you'd find a chrysalis. Chrysalis, I suppose that's the word for it. And if you kept the chrysalis at home, eventually it would turn into a butterfly. That's if you remembered it. If you didn't remember it, well, you'd come back in a few months' time and there would be a dead moth or a dead butterfly in the bottle. We did terrible things to the genetic history of the butterfly in that area with our forgetfulness sometimes, but still, there we go. Okay then. We'd get home and, well, there wasn't much to do, of course. Radio was not big at that time of the afternoon when we would get home, although we were very lucky because around about 6 o'clock the serials would be on. The favourite one that I remember always, and I'm sad to report that virtually all of the series was destroyed, but Mrs. Obbs. Mrs. Obbs was on most nights of the week for many years. She was great. Okay. And then there was Hogan's Circus. I think it was Hagen's Circus, something like that. And, oh dear, that was very good. And there was Green Bottle. Yes, there was also Green Bottle sometimes. And so, the radio had certain enticements, around about 6 o'clock, something like that. Oh, and Tamworth Radio could be gotten. You'd have the 2TM club of some kind. The Argonauts Club, or maybe that was the ABC, I can't remember. But before then, of course, there was supper. Well, I don't know, we didn't call it supper. That's a very Chinese thing. We called it tea. We'd have tea. And, but of course, we had two good trees. We had a mulberry tree, and we had a number of mandarin trees, and also a fig tree. Now, in their seasons, they all bore prolifically. And my mother used to call out when we were eating the mandarins, and I could eat a dozen mandarins, maybe more. And my mother would stick her head out the kitchen window saying, "Don't you boys eat too many of those mandarins or you'll spoil your tea." Well, that wasn't a command that ceased the consumption of these mandarins, because tea was probably boiled pumpkin and boiled potato. And on Saints' Days, I think we'll say Saints' Day, because it had to be something very special. The grand feasts. We may have mashed potatoes, usually accompanied by a slab of stolen mutton. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe Mum cooked some chops from time to time, but chops seem to be the Saturday morning thing. And anyway, in winter, of course, there was only one warm room in the house. That was the kitchen because of the wood stove. And when everyone had retired to bed, I could then get on with my homework because I had to use a kitchen table. I think we might have had only one table, I'm not quite sure, maybe 2 tables. And so then I might finish my homework about 11 o'clock or something like that. Well, I paid attention to this, but I'm not sure that everyone else in the household, all my brothers and sisters, I don't think my brothers and sisters of that age were as religiously committed to doing homework as I was, but nevertheless, there we are. So that was pretty well the week. Oh, yes. We had to also take turns at washing up and wiping up. That was fraught with some danger, of course, because there were no such things as sinks early in the piece, well, certainly not in our house anyway. Excuse me. And you'd have a dish, I don't know, it wasn't a plastic dish, it must have been a tin dish or something, but it was especially for washing dishes. And you'd have, there was no detergent, a bit of soap in a sort of wire frame, and you'd shake the soap in the wire frame. And we were well disciplined there by our sister. You see, one washed and another one wiped, and the other one, I think, put away. Yeah, there were three parts to it. Well, with a wood stove, everything was black and, but that was perfectly normal. And unfortunately, though, well, no, not unfortunate. Well, I suppose it was unfortunate, but we learnt early in the piece to behave ourselves. Because if Janice was washing up and we complained about the quality of her washing, if we thought that, well, if we found imperfection in her washing and we complained about it, she was not a girl who took kindly to that. And we learned very, very quickly that 2 things could happen. Either there'd be a fight, and probably all the washing up water would go on the floor, and there'd be a mess, a terrible mess. That happened a few times. Or Janice knew how to control us. She would say, "If you don't bloody well like it, do yourself," and she would walk off. We learned to like it. And so, we tolerated the intolerable, but that was better than tangling with Janice. Janice, she was the only girl in that area, And how she survived? She survived only by being able to fight and, hold her own. And lovely girl. And she married a wonderful man. And but she was a woman of, stern will, but she had to learn to be a woman of stern will, otherwise she wouldn't have survived. So there we are. Okay, well, that's pretty well what life was like in the milking time. Oh, God. Anyway, eventually it would be decided that the cow, I don't know, maybe she got pregnant or something. I don't know what happened to her. But whatever it is that happened to her, she was turned loose, and she'd probably be turned out to Spring Hill, out to Tom Akers' place. To Spring Hill or Mortlake, I can't remember which one it was. Probably Spring Hill, I think. I don't know. Anyway, she would go and she would rusticate out there for 6 months, having been served by, there must have been a bull roundabout somewhere. But anyway, Ruby would get pregnant. She was very good at that, I would think. And so, when she was enceinte, as they say, we didn't have to do that. And so we were then in a situation where it was non-milking time, and so it was simply the dull routine. And I'm talking about the weekdays, where the tasks were simply reduced to either getting the chips. Well, maybe, I don't know, maybe we refined that a little bit. Maybe it was getting the chips. One got the chips in the wood, and maybe the other one had to light the fire or something. I don't know. But they were more tranquil days, I would have thought, because there were days without that. And so the days sort of went on. And so the half the year was with the cow and half the year was without the cow. And I preferred the days without the cow, I can tell you. She was a bloody awful thing. You know, those cars that Dad had, they were no better. Dad used to, I don't know where he got these cars from. I don't know what he would pay for them, $10, $25 or something, but they never worked. He was, shall we say, personally aggrieved by the fact that they didn't work very much because they always required cranking. Now, I don't know, young people these days may not know that cars needed to be cranked, but in those early days you had to get a crank handle and... Well, I think a well-behaved car started when cranked, but not the cars that Dad got. Oh, dear. He would crank. And, of course, my father was a very noisy man. Oh, dear. It attracted attention, generally. Well, the car usually wouldn't start. It may be a bastard of a car and hint at starting. My father would continue to crank. Well, when things were not all that successful, he then turned to abusing the car. And sometimes he actually belaboured the car. Well, abuse and belabouring and cranking and grunting and generally carrying on didn't work all that well, you know. We could have told him that, but I think he probably enjoyed it, really, you know. You know how an abused woman always returns to the abuser. Well, in the same way, my father would return to the car which had so abused his good intentions. Oh, it was a sad thing. But anyway, there they are. And the one, when he sold that car, you know, to Charlie O'Thief, as he was called, and Charlie O'Thief promised and promised and promised. He received, apparently, final demands. And when ultimately he did promise to pay on a certain weekday when my father was not there, when the boys went up to get the money that Charlie O'Thief had promised, once again he didn't have the money, but he did say, boys, we've got a clucky chook and you can take that instead. Don't know how much a clucky chook is worth, but that's what the car was worth, and I might say probably it was rather more than the car was worth. Oh, a terrible bloody thing. I think, oh dear, there we are. Okay, now that's term time, if you like, mid-week time. Then, of course, well, what do you do during holidays? Now, holidays were terrible times. The worst times I can recall were the holiday times, the long holidays. There were 6 weeks we used to have at Christmas. Now, we didn't have any regular visits to the seaside. We did go down to Brisbane just occasionally, I think, but not necessarily in summer. But it was very occasional, and if you did go, you went down on, I don't know which train it might have been, a Tuesday night train or a Friday night train or something like that. God, no, I can't remember the days. Maybe one train went on Tuesday night, but no matter. You went second class sitter in an engine, steam engine, and you'd arrive in Brisbane black and with red eyes from the specks of coal that got in your eyes, and you were filthy. But nevertheless, on most occasions, we had to stay in Charleville. Now, okay, I tell you, it was like purgatory. I know all about purgatory. Most people these days don't know about purgatory, but listen, I lived through purgatory for years and years. I know all about it. And I know about the nature of eternal damnation, because that's what it was like. 6 weeks, nothing to do, no TV, no computer games, no books, 6 weeks of, what shall we say? Well, your heart beat, you were warm, at least, the body was warm. But what on earth did you do? Well, there wasn't much to do. I can remember, you know, sometimes it was so damn hot, what would you do? And our house was not very high. It was only about 3 feet off the ground. But I'd get under the house on a sort of a stretcher of some kind, and I would lie there out of the heat. But lying there out of the heat was no great fun because, well, I mean, you lay there. Well, okay, you lay there. What did you do? I lay there. No books, nothing. And, of course, there was always the thought a snake would come through, because a snake would come through from time to time, you know. My brother was riding his goat one day down the side of the house. My brother had a goat called Trigger. And there was a cowboy fellow whose horse was called Trigger. Not Roy Reen, he was Momakaki, I think. But anyway, some cowboy fellow in the movies or in the comics had a go. He had a horse called Trigger. Might have been Zorro or something like that, I don't know. But Stuart was riding the goat down the side of the house. Lo and behold, the goat walked over a tiger snake. Well, the goat sort of bucked a little bit. Stuart, thank God, was thrown forward, but Stuart alerted us to the presence of the tiger snake. So my father attacked the tiger snake from on high. He stood on the veranda with a .22, I think it was, and he fired bullets at the tiger snake. And the tiger snake, of course, instead of escaping, the tiger snake, affected aggression, which riveted it there on the spot. And so my father eventually hit it, I suppose, with the bullet, and which was a bit of a miracle, because the goat, the rifle, anything Dad had was not finely calibrated, and so, you could hit a barn with anything that is .303 or whatever, but a snake downstairs a bit hard. But nevertheless, I think he did hit it. But so you'd lie on this couch, just escaping the heat, 120 or whatever it may have been. I remember once, I was very proud of Charleville. Queen City of the West it was called. And one time it was on the news. Well, I felt we were the centre of the universe when Charleville was on the news. We were on the news because we were the hottest town in the state, and it said the temperature was 120. Well, 120, everyone says they didn't blame global warming at least. We were spared that. Anyway, I think 120 is fairly hot. Let's have a look. 120, we take 32 from that. We'll take 30 from that. That's 90. 90 by 510. That's about 50 degrees or something, I think. 50 degrees? 120. 30, 90, 5. Divided by 5. No, that can't be right. No, that could be right. Divide 100 by 90 by 5, 18. 18 by 9, 19. Oh, it wouldn't have been that hot. Look, you take 132 from 120, and then you apply that 5.9 figure, and you get whatever the Fahrenheit figure is. Very, very hot anyway. Too hot for humanity, and much. Well, I tell you, I knew all about purgatory, but in those days, in those 6 weeks holidays, I knew hell. Oh, it was terrible. It went on and on and on, day after day, and what did you do? Well, every now and then, Stuart and maybe Janice and Don and I, we'd go over to the sandhill or something like that. I think we had hats. We usually had hats, although that Don, a cousin, only child, he had one of these elephant shooter hats. We just had those rag hats usually, but Don had an elephant shooter hat. We envied him, I can tell you, because it was very, very stylish. It was almost as if he was in the British Raj in India. And, we felt, like coolies. If you can have a coolie in India, I'm not quite sure, but anyway, whatever. We felt like underlings in the presence of this major from the Raj in the elephant shooter hat. But nevertheless, we didn't have any choice. It was either play with Don or play with no one. So off we would go, and we'd go over the sandhill or the cemetery or sewage treatment works or something, trying to find. We had bows and arrows, those guns, little pellets in them, whatever they may have been. We'd try to shoot happy families, or the Crimson Wings would come in the summer and eat the figs, and we would get the bows and arrows out. We never hit them, of course. I don't know whether the Crimson Wings can laugh at you, but they scorned us because we were absolutely ineffectual, not on the basis of their cunning. We were ineffectual in terms of both our skill and the rather unfortunate nature of the equipment that we had. I think the bows were made from a cedar stick branch, I'm not sure. We may have gone to the mulberry tree for that. Shanghais, of course, you'd get a bit Shanghai from the mulberry tree, the rubber and a bit of leather, but we never hit anything anyway, so there we are. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Okay, But ordinary weekends in school time, let me deal with that. Saturday was a write-off. Oh, an absolute. Maybe Saturday afternoon I might have had some value. You know, it must have had some value for this reason. Saturday morning, nothing could happen because my father would come home from work and Mum and Dad had to go shopping. Now, there was no car, either because they didn't have one or because the car wouldn't start. It usually didn't start, of course. And they would walk uptown and they would go to Espy's and they'd get a big, and you'd several hours later, you'd see them walking home, each of them carrying a great big brown paper bag. Because in those days, nothing was delivered, there was no supermarket, and you'd go to Espy's and you'd get everything, and it'd be put in a big, 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 big brown paper bag, and Mum and Dad would come home, probably fighting, of course, because they were not a pair they were not soulmates, let's put it that way. And they'd argue even over the weather. And whether it was hot, the temperature may be 120, but there'd be a discussion about really whether it was hot or not. And so you'd see them coming home, and then actually Saturday wasn't a bad day, you know, because Dad would come home on Friday evenings, and Dad, being a shearer, he was accustomed to a decent breakfast. And he was having none of this damn rolled oats business. So on Saturday morning, Dad would always cook up, and he would cook. Generally chops, he was very good in chops. But his pièce de résistance was liver. And maybe he cooked that on Sunday morning, but liver has to be very careful. It has to be soaked overnight, you know, I think salty water, and then has to be skinned. Then on the following morning it has to be diced, you know, little cubes. And then it has to be fried, preferably in fairly aged fat. That could be the fat of any number of illicitly gained hoggets, maybe a little bit of beef fat in there somehow or another, but it had to be fried in that. And then there was a particular sauce that Dad made, a very thick sort of sauce. I don't know what he put in there. I wish I knew. I could make a fortune if I could bottle that sauce these days. And Saturday morning breakfast would be Sunday morning breakfast. Very, very wonderful, because Dad thought that a day without a decent breakfast was not a good start at all. But other than that, though, Saturday was never a day of any cooking. Saturday lunch was very standard throughout the years. Sometimes there was certainly flamboyant. Wait a moment, no, sometimes there might have been, we could say, a little bit of cooking on Saturday night, in that Dad might cook fritters. Fritters were leftovers from a little bit of stolen mutton. But Sunday, of course, well, there were two things about it. Sunday was Sunday lunch. Oh, it was worth waiting for. We had everything on Sunday. Mountains of food. Oh, my God. Well, you might have wild duck, chook, occasionally a bit of pork from the pig that we'd reared, a bit of stolen mutton, or occasionally if we bought something, part of the 2-shilling roast. Or then we'd have roast potatoes, roast pumpkin, tin peas, and that might have been about it, I think. The pumpkin, boiled pumpkin, boiled potato, bloody awful. But the Queensland blue was nicely baked, that's a pumpkin, was nicely baked and so on. Okay then. Saturday morning, though, and Saturday afternoon, bloody awful on nothing to read, no games, and so on. Or if there was a game, there'd probably be a fight. We'd go down to Don's place, and we might begin playing down there. Usually snakes and ladders could end fairly peacefully, I think. But we were given sometimes, you know, to differences of opinion. Oh, the differences of opinion were terrible, you know, because it was a strange business. We would fight with Don, and Don would tell on us. I think he'd fabricate, you know. He'd verbal us. But then my mother and his father would then big fight. Now, they wouldn't talk for 6 months. But we, of course, would be talking again next day, and life would be perfectly normal. Mum and Uncle Jack should have learnt that, you know. They should have just kicked us in the arse, but they didn't. But anyway, Saturday, you'd escape the house to escape 4VL. 4VL was a terrible damn thing, because the SP bookies in town had more or less bought 4VL. All day was taken up with the racing acceptances, and then the racing from every racecourse in Australia. was on 4VL. This facilitated the telephone booking of the illegal SP bookies. You know, Dad used to like that, you know. We didn't have a phone. He'd send us down to Gordon's. Gordon's was the first one. Gordon's, strangely enough, they were the first ones with the phone. And you'd have to go down to Gordon and say, Mrs. Gordon, can we use your phone? And it would cost 2 shillings. That was a reasonable price, 2 shillings. And you'd ring up. I can't remember Fraser. Was a Fraser an SP bookie? I'm not sure. But anyway, you'd ring up and Dad would say he wanted 2 and 6 for a place on such and such a horse at such and such a race meeting in race 7, all up another horse for a win. I think he calculated to know that if he got the chance of winning something in the first bet, it would increase the 2 and 6 value maybe to 3 shillings or 4 shillings. And then he'd go for the jackpot and it would be all up so-and-so, whatever horse, for a win. Well, for my father, if this had happened, it would have been like winning Gold Lotto, I suppose. But anyway, you had to escape that, and so we'd head off down the bush. Again, we'd go crayfishing, you know, down near there's a little pool down near the gully. Or we'd go to the cemetery, or we'd go to the pensioners' huts and so on, or we wouldn't go to their huts, but we'd wander through, because we knew a few of the pensioners. Or we'd go down, we'd pass the sewage treatment works. We didn't go very far because, well, you've seen one drain from the sewage treatment works. You've seen them all. There was a merry-go-round at the sewage treatment works. We'd often like to have ridden on that, but we didn't, you know, because we would have had to climb over a tall fence with barbed wire at the top. But in any case, I think we believed that only feral children would do that, and there are a number that we could name. But we didn't ever do that, of course. But other than that, though, there really wasn't much to do, I can tell you. And our life was rather dull. Okay, so that was pretty well, you know, if you're looking for entertainment within the home and within the home environment, which meant playing in the sand. Of course, we used to do some terrible things, you know. We'd fight with Don, you know. But Don was only one. We had the numbers. I remember once, you know, he I don't know what the fallout was over, but this was much excitement. I think it was a Saturday morning. Mum and Dad must have been shopping, and Don surrounded the house. But Don didn't know, you see, that, you know, those Spy versus Spy comics or movies or whatever many years ago. And Don didn't know quite where we were, but we would know where Don was. We'd look out and we'd see Don. And Don was surrounding the house. Maybe he would be throwing things at us. Not successfully, because he wouldn't know which window we were going to open. We'd open the window, we'd throw at him. No, we were free to throw almost anything because almost everything had been thrown. And so if we threw something, anything that we threw, maybe a silver vase, but all the silver vases in our houses were at an angle anyway because they had long since been thrown, probably by Mum, because Mum was a very good thrower, you know. And so anyway, we'd throw this stuff at him. I can remember we threw a cake tin at him. We probably threw anything weighty. We didn't. I don't know whether we were trying to hit him or not. We probably weren't. But anyway, he had one up on us, you know. He had surrounded the house with no good result. But he remembered that we had borrowed from his father a clucky chook. These clucky chooks, they feature in 2 stories. He remembered that we'd borrowed a clucky chook. So he went and he took the clucky chook and marched off home, and that was the end of our clucky chook. We got our own back on him, though. Now, I get the blame, you know. If you talk to Don, if you talk to Stuart, probably Janice, they would tell you that all these terrible things that happened was mine. No, that wasn't true. I'm sure that I wasn't responsible for every bad idea, but I do remember this one. It was my idea. The postman used to come past in the afternoon on Saturday afternoons. The train would come in, the mail would be sorted, and then the postman would come around and he would deliver the post. And I thought, well, Don's house is just down the road. and the postman is coming past, and I'm sure Don would like to receive a parcel. So we created a parcel for him, and we got the parcel, and we wrapped it up, and we marked it to Master Don Beelby, King Street, Charleville. And it looked very genuine. The postman came past. I can't remember what his name was, but he was a nice man, I'm sure. And we said, "Oh, would you mind delivering this down to Don's place?" Don was, 1, 2 blocks down, 3 blocks, 3 allotments down, you see. Well, surprisingly, the postman accepted the commission, and he delivered the fake parcel down to Don's place. Oh, well, we weren't present at it. Oh dear. Look, I should be embarrassed. I should be embarrassed, but I'm not. Stuart and I decided that we would do an experimental thing into the box, shoebox. We must have had new shoes about that time. But we did an excremental thing into the shoebox, wrapped it all up, put the string around it, and had it delivered by the postman officially to Don Beelby of King Street. Oh dear. I don't know whether any fracas ensued from that or not, but Don had a wonderful mother, Gladdy, wonderful woman, lovely woman, and I'm not long. Okay. Now this is true, but this is a little bit earlier. It's also excrementitious, shall we say. In those days, bread wasn't sliced, and bread, if you bought a loaf of bread, came in 2 parts, so that you could be broken in half, and you could have half a loaf if you wanted. Auntie Glad wanted half a loaf of bread. Well, if the bread was very fresh, you could peel a wonderful layer of this warm, fresh bread off. Oh, it was very wonderful. Well, anyway, we went out to Moore's shop, and Auntie Glad wanted half a loaf of bread. So we got half the loaf of bread, and for some reason or other, we peeled the... I don't know, maybe it was wickedness on my part, and maybe I pre-thought this rather than acted spontaneously. But I said to everyone, that's Stuart and Don, what a good idea it would be if we ate, because, the crust was very thick, we take the layer of bread off and we keep that, we reserve it. Then we could eat all the bread inside, so that in fact the shell of the bread loaf was still there, but the inside was empty. So we ate all of it. Oh, it was lovely bread. It was warm, and the bread in those days, much better than the bread now. Well, I thought it would be a very good idea, because we were near the Goodmans, We must have been walking home via the Goodmans. And there's always horse shit and goat pills. But we chose the horse shit. So we filled this is a terrible thing. But we did, this is true, and I have to confess, we filled the half loaf of bread with horse shit. And then we placed the initial layer over the front of the bread, so that this lovely loaf of bread looked like a genuine loaf of bread. Well, came tea time. Oh dear. Oh, I am embarrassed to tell you. But Auntie Glad put the half loaf of bread out on the table, and she got the bread knife, and of course they would have had a very sharp and nicely handled bread knife. Ours would have been a bread knife, possibly a little bent, but certainly usually with no handle. That's just how everything was. But anyway, Auntie Glad decided she will produce bread for... Uncle Jack couldn't have been home at the time, because if Uncle Jack had been home, there would have been thunder, and it would have been like this outbreak of war. Must have been during the week, because Auntie Glad must have been sitting there with Don, and she decided, spoilt brat, of course, that he was, and Auntie Glad decided that she would cut a slice of bread for Don's delectation, and hers. Well, she cut the bread, and out cascaded the horse shit. Well, what do you do? Auntie Glad opted for silence, but she recalled the tale for many years as did we. Well, we felt a certain amount of guilt, but the fact that she cut the bread without discovering that it was really a fake loaf of bread, Don may have got bashed or something, I don't know. I don't think that Don would have been bashed, because Don was the only child. Don, because Don had things that we didn't have. Now, their house was a lovely house. Everything inside was very good, in good order. A very, very nice house. And anyway, but it was like all Charleville houses because they had a little bit of couch grass lawn in front, but the rest of the yard was, the usual sandy soil that exists in that part of town. Maybe in all parts of the town, I don't really know. But at one stage, that spoilt brat Don, may have been after the war, could have been, yes, it had to be, because he was given a red pedal bike. No, but not bike, car. It's a car like this, a bit long like this, and one child could fit, and the child was supposed to pedal, and in that way he would be able to propel himself around the yard. But it didn't really work, because the wheels were narrow wheels, might have had a little bit of rubber around them and so on, but you couldn't use the car on the couch grass lawn. That simply didn't work. Nor could you use this pedal car on the sandy because the narrow wheels would cut down into the sandy soil. And so I don't know what happened. It was more a car for looking at. We never actually got a ride. Well, it wasn't worth getting a ride in it anyway because you couldn't pedal it on grass and you couldn't pedal it on the sandy soil. So it was not a well-chosen toy, but nevertheless, it excited envy in us. And we didn't wish that car well, but Don had it for quite some years, as far as I know. I think they used to have a cement footpath going up to their front steps, but that, was only a few metres long. You could use the car then, you could pedal there for about 3 or 4 metres, maybe. But our life was filled either with a vacuum. Now, nature abhors a vacuum, I know, but nature never actually filled it for us. That was a great problem. And insofar as we might have filled it with the fruit from Uncle Jack's trees, the grapes from his vines. Nature didn't fill the vacuum with that either. And nature didn't fill it with the peddling of that car. But he did, though, sometimes he had Meccano sets, but I couldn't have cared less about the Meccano sets. I mean, what, for God's sake, can you do with a Meccano set where the way of attaching bits and pieces was with screws and nuts and that type of thing? I thought that was a pretty boring damn thing. But Don did maybe Don had some comics. I know that Spec Heinemann had comics. I used to like calling into Spec Heinemann's because he always had a lot of comics that I envied him enormously. But he was a nice fellow, and so you wished him no ill will. He was a good fellow, good fellow. And they had a lovely house too, and his mother cooked those lovely cupcakes. Oh, I remember them. But I do remember my mother insisting that we not display our ignorance and our lack of manners and our general deprivation by wolfing those things into us. 2 was all I went to the Spec's party once, and I ate only 2 of them out of deference to my mother's instructions. Oh, she had some bad rules as far as I was concerned, but we stuck by them, but still. But I didn't envy Spec. Spec had, and Spec shared quite well. And I think Don shared reasonably well. I'm not sure. But of course, as we spent a lot of time fighting, there are only intermittent possibilities of his playing, Lord Bountiful anyway. So there. But anyway, that was what life was like if I just take, ordinary routine. Now, of course, that's all within the area of the home. The home, King Street, the big tree, the gully, and all that type of thing. Eventually I'll get on to the public entertainments. And so that is an exciting thing awaiting another talk.